Here on Budget Bin, I am always on the lookout for cheap parts that provide just enough performance without breaking the bank. I usually buy used parts to accomplish this, but sometimes I will get something new if it is a good enough deal, like if it's RAM or storage or whatever. Recently I was looking at GPUs since I needed to build some PCs for a few associates of mine, and I wanted them to have something decent enough to last them for a while. So I decided I would be taking a chance here and do something that might be honestly a huge scam. So follow along as we examine and look at buying brand new GPUs from Aliexpress. Many PC enthusiasts know if it's too good to be true, it's too good to be true. But what if there is a middle ground within this reasoning? Like something reasonably priced with a performance that matches what it is worth, or maybe just a little bit more of a fortunate trade-off because you took the road less traveled. Normally I do something like that by finding a used card on eBay, but it becomes a challenge to do this with the more higher end parts. This led me to curiously try many websites to look for deals where you would least expect them. And of course, I went on ahead to Aliexpress.com to see if they had something that I was looking for, which led me to stumble upon these guys. New RX 580 and RX 5500 XT graphics cards? This is too good to be true, right? They can't be this cheap and be the real deal. After a bit of thought and skepticism going into it, and some quick research, I caved in and bought both of them without reading too much into the actual products outside the fact that they were new graphics cards, which, since I purchased them both from the same manufacturer, I was given $25 off. Sweet. And they were shipped and received very quickly, in about 2-ish weeks. But let's pause for a second. Before we can look at the products, there's absolutely a catch here. Things are too good. For starters, right after I bought and received these GPUs, the products pages changed very quickly. As you could tell, I was showing snapshots of what the original product pages looked like. The current ones constantly update and change prices, and I regret not taking enough screenshots to show you examples. But it would say things like new, to used, to refurbished. Now they just state that they are cards that you can mine crypto on. They even changed their photos, which deceived me initially with the RX 580 since in the title and description, I was assuming I was getting a 8GB card, when in reality I got a 4GB one instead. And at the end of the day, I kind of expected a little foul play when getting these cards. But even then, with the prices, as long as the performance matches up to what we currently have, this isn't bad in the slightest. The only concern is that these cards were being used for mining and possibly could be worn out a little. However, in the new descriptions, it mentions that they were briefly used and were stress tested before being sold. Hopefully this is true because otherwise there could be problems with these guys, especially in the near future. But enough of the nitty-gritty details about the weird or shady practices that are done when selling these cards. Let us see how these new video cards actually perform. I went on ahead and gave Rainbow Six Siege a benchmark test to stress out the RX 580 and see what it is capable of to start off with. The card itself is actually a downgraded version of the RX 580 with only 2048 shaders instead of the 2304 you would normally get. Even the clock speeds are a little less since normally they are around 1250 MHz, but in this case the base clock speed is 1180 MHz. Besides having half the RAM of a typical RX 580, that is most of what is missing. I just hope the GPU silicon isn't worn or anything from any of the mining the card has done. And thankfully, it ran great with no stuttering or large frame drops. With an average of 158 frames per second, it should be a decent GPU to play with for only $60, even if the minimum frame rate is 122 frames per second. So far, things don't seem too bad. We will truly know how good the RX 580 is after a few more games though. The next game I benched was Deus Ex Mankind Divided, which, despite OBS not being able to record footage for it correctly for whatever reason, ran pretty great. Here's a side-by-side along to show you what I mean. And of course, the frame data doesn't lie. With an average of about 58 frames per second, it isn't really too bad for an RPG such as this game. And obviously, theoretically speaking, you can easily reduce settings to make things run a lot smoother. Not that that is really necessary for a game like this, but the option is always there. crazy that this is still as good looking as it is with the high settings. Anyhow, we should move on to the next game. Arma 3 ran very well too, considering I am running at the same settings as I did with the RX 460 from my last video. With an average of 56 frames per second and a half, I would say there is plenty of playability with this GPU with war sims such as this one. Turning the settings down to medium would probably make this run twice as smooth, I imagine. Not that you would need to do that to enjoy this game, but the option is always there. So far, so good. But one last new AAA game should seal the deal on whether or not this was a good investment or not. The final game I decided to go with was Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 Remastered, since I could barely run that with the RX 460 and I wanted to see what a GPU a generation ahead of it with twice the VRAM could do. I turned the settings up to Ultra Maxish and was surprised with how nicely it ran even when there was a lot of action going on. 66 frames per second is no joke for an average frame rate like this, especially with such a low budget for our GPU. Well, I think this is a great deal for $60, despite the fact that there was a lot of false advertisements, and even if I knew I was going to get a 4GB model with less CUDA cores and whatnot, I honestly would have still gotten this card. The 5500 XT might be a different story on the other hand. While we did receive what was advertised for the most part, besides it definitely being a used mining card, it could have poor performance for the price. I guess we will just have to see and compare to our previous GPU. Starting off with Rainbow Six Siege, averaging 191 frames per second, which is more than 30 frames on average than what the RX 580 was throwing out. Plus, this frame data matches what most people get when they benchmark with the same generic 8GB RX 5500 XTs. So far, so good. Despite the fact that both these cards consume the same amount of VRAM, it still is a lot nicer for the value. Even the minimum frame rate, having gone up nearly 30 frames per second, is another good thing to look at here, since a whole lot of the action can happen all at once in this title. For $100, this could be a GPU worthwhile. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. The Deus Ex benchmark, which with once again shoddy footage that doesn't represent the actual frame data, was running on average at 66 frames per second, which is almost 10 frames more than the RX 580. A small but nicer difference in terms of getting more out of a better card. However, is a $40 price difference worth the cost? After all, who cares about the small frame rate increase when you are on a budget and can't spare that $40 that you could use for another part? Well, maybe the other two games will give us a better answer to that question. I ran Arma 3 at the same settings and received around the same results, if not worse, than the RX 580. But to be fair, I did record around 10,000 more frames of data for this benchmark in comparison to the other one, so do what you will with that information. 55.5 frames per second as an average is still not that bad though. I tried to get a similar benchmark experience as the last one, but at the end of the day, I still think this isn't too shabby. The price is still a bit iffy. I think maybe for titles or programs where you may use 8GB of VRAM for whatever reason, this GPU may be really decent, especially since it's GDDR6 RAM as opposed to the RX 580's GDDR5s. I should have tested this with other games or programs, but honestly I feel like it wouldn't change much of our results at the end of the day. Speaking of which, our last game for the last time, Call of Duty, at the same settings as the RX 580, had an average of about 69 frames per second, and for the most part seemed to be better or decent overall. It is hard to test these things when you have multiple variables to work with parts that are already pretty close together performance-wise, which honestly, I am pretty satisfied with. The results, all things considered, are not bad, and these are newer GPUs with a lot of driver support. But hold on, I'm getting ahead of myself. I think we should wrap up the whole frame data analysis here and make a final decision about these graphics cards. So in conclusion, should you buy these GPUs? Personally, I want to say yes. The cards I got were great and ran with virtually no problems. The prices were not bad, and I think they're pretty cool. And I have to commend the manufacturer for the heatsink since none of these cards went over 70 degrees Celsius, which is hard to accomplish even with some modern GPU heatsinks today. However, I have a bias, not because I might have been paid by G-Shul or however you pronounce it to sell out to you guys about how amazing and how great of a deal these GPUs really are, but because you yourself, the viewer, could have varying results. My GPUs are great, but the GPUs you may receive ordering off Aliexpress from any of these brands could break after a short period of time or need to be underclocked in order to run without crashing under load. I checked other YouTubers who tried this even, and I couldn't find many of them mentioning this. But this isn't uncommon to see when you buy GPUs from sketch places like Aliexpress. To be fair, eBay and Craigslist are no better from time to time. And while these manufacturers claim they can help you with the problems you may have, I imagine they will only do so much since they are probably not making much off of some old GPUs that were probably just meant for mining only. My only exception here on why you, the viewer, should buy one of these is if you are a true enthusiast, as in, you like tweaking parts to specific values, or you like Frankensteining machines with weird parts to bring new life to them. And even then, I am not sure if even an enthusiast should still do that. Nonetheless, at the end of the day, these were some pretty interesting GPUs, even if they didn't turn out to be exactly what they were. At least they were pretty cheap and had some great performance for the price. Hopefully you all enjoyed this video. Please comment what you would like to see next. Maybe I will buy an RTX 3080 off this website if enough people ask, and we can see if it even works. Also, leave a like or consider subscribing if you want to see more content like this. And as always, thanks for watching.